Right, ladies and gentlemen, very good afternoon and welcome, as I said, to your first business ethics lecture of this module programme. For anyone that might have missed my introduction at the start, my name is Akmal Sunner. I've very recently finished my PhD at the University of Strathclyde, looking specifically at innovation ecosystem strategy. But as part of my learning, I've touched on a few different areas of business practice, amongst them business ethics, global corporate social responsibility, and more recently, the impact of United Nations Sustainability Development Goals on business practice and policy. Okay, so I'm going to hopefully try and disseminate some of that knowledge, some of that experience with you today. So what are we going to be doing today? So firstly, a kind of a short agenda for today's session. Really, I want to spend time today making sure that you all have a fairly robust understanding of what is corporate social responsibility. And the CSR is a term that's been branded for a few years now. I'm sure everyone on the call has at least heard, if not has already, as a small understanding of what CSR is and what it represents. But what does it mean in the business world? Because that's really why we're here today. We're here to understand, well, why is corporate social responsibility such a big issue, and what does it mean for businesses that are trying to contend with delivering on or developing the necessary skills that are required to uphold their responsibility as corporate socially responsible firms. We're also looking at the Global Development Goals. So I discussed earlier United Nations and their developmental goals. Well, I want to spend some time with you today and discuss, what do we mean by those global developmental goals? Why, firstly, are they different to CSR? And if so, how are they different? These are all concepts we will be looking at this afternoon. We'll also be trying to touch on the link between CSR itself, human rights globalization, so the human rights movement across the world, and finally the idea of internationalization. Now, we all know that business is no longer country specific or even continent specific. You now get multinational or multi-corporate organizations that actually expand the globe. You get, for example, Coca-Cola, which is available worldwide. You have mobile phone brands. I'm sure many of you on the call have got a Samsung or an Apple mobile phone. These are all globally corporate brands that don't know any national or even international boundaries. They extend the whole globe. So it's about thinking, what's the link between what a business does from a CSR perspective, what the world expects of them from a human rights perspective, and finally from a business perspective, how do we tie that together under the umbrella of internationalization? We'll also try to gain insights into why a business should care. So again, we talked about CSR and why CSR might be important, but so what? If CSR is important, why should a business care about it? What does a business need to do to deliver on its CSR objectives, to deliver on its CSR responsibilities? And finally, we'll think a little bit about your critical essay, because that's what you have to produce at the end of this module. So I want you to kind of think about discussing the role of a business in helping to tackle SDG problems. That's just one thing you could possibly do, but as part of your module assessment, you need to think about, what is the role of business ethics or corporate social responsibility, as we will discuss, and why it's important. Now, sustainability development goals is just something I'm suggesting. You don't have to look at that. That's just one route I'm going to take you down to demonstrate to you the importance of how you can understand business ethics and the nature of organizational practice. So that is a very quick fire walkthrough of the schedule or the agenda for today. But we're going to start off by looking at this here. So this is what we call the 3 pillars of corporate sustainability. Now, this is a model that was developed to look at, okay, what is it that makes a business enduring, long-lasting? Why is it that a business needs to be aware of different factors beyond just what we call the bottom line, which is your profit? Okay, anyone can do profit. Profit is pretty simple to deal with, but what about the other things that businesses are responsible for? And that's what I want to touch on here with you all today as well. So let's take it from the top. We've got the economic branch. So of this this Van Dam diagram here, you've got the economic branch, which includes things like innovation, capital efficiency. We're talking about risk management here as well. We're looking at growth enhancement and total shareholder return. So again, perhaps the kinds of things you would associate with a business, okay? That's what you would think. They care about, managing risk. They care about where they're investing their capital. They care about shareholder return. So nothing perhaps too out there, or perhaps too ambiguous about the content of that column. But as part of that, they want to make sure that they're creating jobs for the economy. They want to make sure that they're enhancing the skills of their workers. They're making impacts in a local community, whether it be from an economic perspective or whether it be from any other. Community investments. A number of times a business is involved in a local community, whether it be through local initiatives to involve younger generations, whether it be through community regeneration programs, whether it be through running schemes that allow more disadvantaged communities to be able to gain something from the presence of a large corporate. But these are all things that take place, and as part of that, business ethics is an important element, okay? It's about the ethical or the moral compass, you could argue, of a business entity. It's about making sure that the business is seen not only to be saying the right things, but to also be doing the right things. So we call that crossover between economic and, for example, social, the equity component, okay? It's not just about profit, it's also about what are you giving back as a business. Under social dimension, we will talk about things like human rights. We talk about things like community reach, labour relations. These things are all important because these are the things that link together the business and what it's aiming to do, but also with what the business should be doing to deliver on its CSR responsibilities. So human rights extend beyond just looking after your employees. It's also about thinking of your supply chain. If you're a large corporate that's sourcing materials from the Far East, for example, or if you are a construction company and you've got workers coming across from the Middle East or places where you've got a lot of labour nowadays, you need to make sure that you're looking after them. It's not just about making sure you're doing the right thing in the country where you're selling your products. It's not about doing the right thing in the Western world alone. It's also about ensuring that you're fair throughout the supply chain. It's about making sure that labour conditions, labour relations, it's about making sure that community programmes that are in existence are reflective of your company practice. If you're doing the right thing in the UK or in the US, you should also be doing the right thing in the Far East. You should be doing the right thing in Pakistan, in India, and Bangladesh. You should be doing the right thing throughout your global reach. And that ties into the endurability component, which is the crossover between society and environment. It's about making sure that the company is adhering to environmental regulations. It's about ensuring that global climate change conditions, it's about ensuring crisis management conditions, which we've seen with the pandemic very recently, and the environmental justice component. These are all things that are important to a business because it's about looking after the social good, but also doing the right thing by the environment, okay? For the environment component, businesses use up what are called resources, okay? That's your land, your labour, your capital. And enterprise as well. Okay, so clean air, water, and land. You've got natural resources that sit as part of that. You've got emissions and waste reduction targets. You've got biodiversity, and more increasingly, you've also got a sustainability element, and that's something that ties everything together. Okay, to be a sustainable business, you need to be able to balance the economic need, which is your profits, which is about making sure your business stays afloat, with the social element, which is all about ensuring that you're doing the right thing by your people, you're doing the right thing by your workers, you're doing the right thing by the local community, by the countries in which you operate, and the environment as well. Okay, so that's about the labour intensive utility rate, I should say. It's all about ensuring that when your workers are using resources, they're doing them effectively, they're doing them efficiently, they're not causing harm to the environment. Okay, so 3 pillars of corporate social responsibility, or what we now term sustainability more recently, is that combination of economic, social, and environmental factors. So let's break that down further. I mean, a diagram is good, but let's put in some quotations here to build up your knowledge. Is that a question there from someone? Sorry, if you could just make sure you're on mute unless you have a question, okay? Thank you. Coming back to where we were, sorry. So what is corporate social responsibility? How do we define that? So a couple of definitions here, some ranging back to the early 1970s. So Ray Carroll in the 1979 described social responsibility as being something that concerns businesses that encompass the economic, legal, ethical, and discretionary expectations that society has of organisations at any given point in time. So even in the 1980s, when perhaps CSR wasn't as a big a deal, shall we say, on corporate agendas, on what board level members were considering as being key objectives for an organisation, there's still a recognition that social responsibility is something that goes beyond the bottom line, as I was saying already. Sorry, could I just ask you guys to go into mute unless you have a question? Apologies, guys. Somebody forgetting to go into mute. I'll put them in mute now. We shouldn't have any more interruptions. So sorry, yes, coming back to Ray Carroll in 1979. So even in the early 80s, there was a consideration of what social responsibility may be. We then move forward. World Business Council for Sustainable Development, just before the turn of the century. Now, this is when CSR really took off with the development, with the Millennial goals. So in the year 2000, the Millennial goals were announced, and that's when CSR became even more prominent on the agenda of organisations throughout the globe. So they described it as the continuing commitment by businesses to behave ethically and to contribute to economic development whilst improving the quality of life of the workforce and their families, as well as the local community and society at large. So again, a fairly loaded definition there, but touching very much on the people element, okay? Thinking about the impact that a business has on people. Now, that doesn't have to be a direct impact through employment or through different roles played in the organisation itself, but it can be through the impact of the business physically being there. If you're living in the same area as a large factory that's pumping emissions into the air, what does that mean for the quality of life that you lead? What does that mean to what you can and can't do in your local area if you have a large chemical plant on your doorstep? So again, businesses were made to feel more obliged to do something about the impact they were having on people's lives. And that was something that CSR was really all about in the early days. But then it was recognised that it's beyond just the well-being of people. So Kotler and Lee, two very prominent authors, in 2005 stated that CSR is a commitment to improving the community well-being through discretionary business practices and the contributions of corporate resources. So it wasn't just about people, it's about the whole community. It's about the local building, it's about the local environment, it's about the local social space as well. If there's lots of corporates, big factories on your doorstep, do you have the necessary living environment that you want to be perhaps living in? Do you have the social space perhaps that you would like? So it's almost about giving companies a role in ensuring that they're not just exploiting the land, they're not just exploiting the resource, they're also giving something back to the local community. Okay, so that's what Kotler and Lee were suggesting, that a business at their own discretion may wish to invest their own physical capital in giving something back to local communities where they operate. And similarly, the World Bank in the year 2008 came up with a fairly more developed version of the definition. That they explained that CSR is the commitment of businesses to contribute to sustainable economic development, working with employees, their families, the local community, and society at large to improve the quality of life in ways that are both good for business and good for development. So here we're talking not just about the lives of people, we're talking here about how do you make things better for business. So this is about ensuring it's sustainable. So for example, if you think of plastic carrier bags, if you go back 10, 15 years, plastic carrier bags were given out for free with your shopping. You didn't have to pay any extra money. And in some parts of the world, that's still the case. You don't pay any extra for consuming disposable bags, or disposable, so they were claimed to be. But nowadays, if you come to the Western world, if you come to the UK, you'll be charged at least 10 pence, in some cases 20 pence, if you ask for a plastic carrier bag to put your shopping in. Why? Because because these things have an impact on the local environment. The way in which a business conducts itself, the way in which a business sells its product, packages its product, all has a direct impact on the globe. Okay, so it's about thinking, why is CSR important? Now, I've given you a few definitions. I've also explained what I think CSR is. I'm now handing it over to you. If you could take a couple of minutes just to think of how you would explain CSR, how you would, if someone was to ask you today, what is corporate social responsibility, how would you explain it to them? So if you could spend a minute or two and just type it into the chat what you think CSR is, that would be great. So in the chat, if you could just please explain to me what you think CSR is, and I'll give you a minute or two to do that. Thank you. Oh, I'm not seeing anything come through yet. So in the chat, please, if anyone, if you're not sure where the chat is, if you look at the bottom, you've got the option to chat. So if you just press the chat button, and then if you could please just tell me how you would explain what corporate social responsibility is, that would be great. Thank you. Okay, I've not had anything come through yet, so that means one of two things. You're either getting bored of what I'm saying, or you've not quite understood what CSR is. So I'm hoping it's the latter, and I can try and explain to you further. So basically, CSR is the ethical behaviour of a company towards society. Okay, in the very simplest terms, or layman terms, you would understand CSR as being what is the company's behaviour from an ethical standpoint towards society at large. Another quotation here that you might find useful for your essays if anyone's looking to touch on CSR as part of their module assignment. So actions that appear to further some social good beyond the interests of the firm and that which is required by law. Okay, so almost providing a more structural definition. So actions taken by a business that further some kind of social good that go beyond the interests of the company itself. So if we think about a business itself, what is its fundamental interest? Probably to make a profit. That's what they're concerned about. They want to make money. But for CSR, it's nothing to do with making money. It's going beyond that interest. It's about thinking, what can I do as a business enterprise to give something back to society? Okay, and that's what CSR really is all about. And this diagram here, which is quite small actually, I should revisit that, brings that together. Okay, so it's about tying together business, society, and environment to think about what are the actions that can be taken to deliver on all three fronts. Right, another question. I've seen some chats coming through, which is fantastic. So thank you to everyone that did take the time to put that in. I really do appreciate your comments there. I have another question for you. So do you believe that a corporation, so a large multinational or enterprise or a large company, take for example Coca-Cola, take for example Apple, Samsung, can they have a CSR or can they have a holistic CSR where they deliver on societal needs and goals? What do you think? And if you could make it beyond just yes and no, that would be great. So, if you think they can be good CSR citizens, then tell me how and why. And if you think they can't, if you could do the same, please, why can they not? So thinking about corporations, large enterprises, global businesses, can they or can they not have a social conscience almost? Are they CSR? Nope, someone's saying yes, great. If you could just expand on that for me, please. So why do you think they can? If anyone wants to say it out loud, feel free to come off mute and give me your answer. That's absolutely fine as well. Oh, I've got a couple of answers come through. Good. Let's have a look. So I've got someone here saying the Duke has corporate social responsibility towards the environment and ensuring sustainable development goals, especially for developing countries. Okay. Others saying it's mostly for large corporations that can contribute or donate to the community. That's a very, very good point. Yeah, these are excellent, guys. This is basically what I want you to be thinking about. Okay, so I'll just script a slide. No, this one here. Okay, so yeah, they can. I would agree with you. And somebody talked about it only being the large corporations that have that ability. I would say yes, it's true that large corporates have more resources, therefore they can afford perhaps to do more in the local society, local community. But equally, the small businesses are the ones that are usually more connected. They're the ones that usually have better links to the local community. They're the ones that usually know what a local community wants. And yes, they might not have the same amount of resource. Okay. They might not have the same amount of money, they might not have the same amount of capital that they can give back to society, but they usually have ideas, they usually have approaches that are more tailored to the needs of a local community. So a couple of things that I wanted to bring to your attention. What are some of the kind of global social challenges? What are the big things that are affecting society more kind of contemporary times? So on the left-hand side, these are all statistics taken from the ILO. They are a little bit outdated. They're almost 10 years old now. In fact, they are 10 years old. But ILO stated in 2011 that 1.4 billion people in the world are still living on less than $1.25 a day. And if you think about that, for us in the Western world, £1.25 or $1.25 is nothing. We would expect to earn that every couple of minutes, perhaps, depending on what job we're in. But there's people in the world that are living on less than $1.25 a day. 1.75 billion people are experiencing multi-dimensional poverty, with deprivations in health, economic opportunities, education, and living standards. Almost a billion people are suffering from chronic hunger. 2.6 billion, that's over 1/3 of the global population almost, do not have access to improved sanitation. And 884 million people do not have access to improved sources of drinking water. So if you think about that, and you think about the impact that business could possibly have to improving that, there's lots of potential for what businesses can do. Number of businesses that are operating in some of these developing or underdeveloped countries, think about the potential that there is for them to make a significant difference to the lives of billions of people across the globe. I'm not going to read every single statistic because they're all there in front of you, but I hope this perhaps brings to life the issues that we're talking about here, okay? Because sometimes we think of CSR and we think, oh, they've done a good initiative for charity, or they've raised money for a cancer trust. I'm not saying these are bad things, these are also good things, but these things aren't necessarily the things that are affecting us as a global society, okay? These are things that are nice to do. These are things that perhaps create good PR. But if we think about the true social responsibility, particularly of those large corporations, the ones that operate in some of the most poorest countries in the world, because they know they can get away with paying people less than $1.25, these are the challenges that we really need to be tackling, okay? So what are the kind of CSR commitments that a business needs to commit to, that we start to eradicate some of these issues? We've got more wider issues in the right-hand column. So again, if we're not looking at the statistics, if we just to kind of read what the kind of more prominent issues that are affecting global society, you've got human rights, which we've talked about already. We've got workplace and employee issues, including occupational health and safety, organizational governance, marketplace and consumer issues. We've got stuff around stakeholder involvement. So remember, stakeholders are anyone and everyone that has an interest in the business. It doesn't have to be employees or managers. It can be local community, it can be the government, it can be policymakers, it can be local media. Anyone could have an interest in that business. So stakeholders. Environmental aspects, including stuff that we talked about already, such as the local environment, greenhouse gas emissions, etc. But also about social development. It's about developing the area, developing the country, developing the region, such that the benefits are there for everyone, not just a select few. And I'm just going to revisit the chat because I think there's been a couple more answers that have come through. And yes, absolutely, everyone that's commented, I agree with your perspectives. Someone said here that individual employees also have a responsibility. I think that's an excellent point. Perhaps one that gets missed, the role of the individual in an enterprise. Obviously, a business will do what it can do or what it wants to do, but if individuals within that corporation are making the push for the business to do more, then it's got more of a what's the word I'm looking for? A manifesto almost from its own people, from its own organization. If we were all employees working for Apple and we all pushed Apple to do better in certain parts of the world, say Far East Asia, where perhaps they've been accused of having poor labour regulations, workers' rights. If we all were working at Apple and we were pushing Apple, you would argue that there's more potential for them to make a bigger difference. So absolutely, individual members can make a difference, but here we're looking more at it from the collective, okay? We're looking at it from an organizational level, but absolutely, you could argue that individuals also have a role to play. So what are some of these elements that we're talking about from a wider societal perspective? So firstly, human rights. So I'm sure we're all aware of what human rights are, but they're basically entitlements held by the virtue of being a human being, okay? So these are all fundamental for the dignity and worth of human beings. So the ILO have outlined the human rights. This is what we're all entitled to, no matter where we live on this planet. There's a definition taken from the ILO website. So all human beings, irrespective of race, creed, or sex, have the right to pursue both their material well-being and their spiritual development in conditions of freedom and dignity, of economic security and equal opportunity. Now, of course, there's an onus on the individual to try and secure that. I mean, you can't necessarily give someone everything if they're not wanting to make an effort. If someone doesn't want to work, then how are they going to secure their economic future? Probably not very well. But the point we're trying to make here is human beings have a right to be able to pursue these goals. No one should be stopping them. No one should be preventing them from securing this if they so want, okay? And how are these human rights set out? So you've got Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which includes 30 different articles. And I think between them, these articles have over thousands of pages worth of declarations that lay out what human rights are and what human rights represent. The Global Compact, which is 10 principles developed by some of the most advanced economies in the world that were thinking about, okay, what is our role in developing the rest of the world? The OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises. And finally, the ILO, who we looked at already, Tripartite Declaration of Principles concerning multinational enterprise. So here we're looking more at what guidance is there for businesses. Now, again, the problem is this is just guidance, okay? A lot of the recommendations, a lot of the guidance that's provided isn't something that a business is required to do by law. It's not mandated of them. And unfortunately, that means that you get a mixed response. Now, that's not to say all businesses are the same. Some of them go above and beyond. Some businesses deliver on all of the guidelines and then some. they go over above and beyond what they're meant to, whilst others perhaps make the minimum effort. As far as they're concerned, as long as they're doing what they're legally required to do, everything else is a guideline only, and therefore there's no obligation for them to comply. So again, these are probably links that you might want to revisit when you get around to writing your assignment and discussing what CSI is all about and where businesses should be looking to make an impact. These links will give you some additional information about the needs and wants of people across the world. So a couple of questions again. As you might have discovered by now, I like to run my lectures a little bit more interactive. I like to see what you guys are thinking, what you guys are feeling about the lecture so far, and I think questions is a good way to do that. So 2 questions this time. Number 1, do you believe that human rights is more of a Western concept, i.e. something that we talk about in the Western world, or the, as the literature would say, the more developed world in this part that we live in? Are human rights more of a Western concept, something that we talk about or concern ourselves about? And secondly, should they be more universal if you believe they aren't already? So is there a need to make the human rights perspective a lot more inclusive of different countries, a lot more obedient to in countries where it doesn't quite exist yet? So the significance of human rights across the globe. So question 1, are human rights mostly a Western concept? And question 2, do you believe there's a need to make them more universal? Again, I'll give you a few minutes, and if you could type your answer in the chat, that'll be most appreciated. Well, a couple of things coming through in the chat now. Yep, so HR or diverse cultural with traditional Western cultural concept. Yeah, okay, with international child making it universal. Absolutely, that's a very good point. So human rights are probably a diverse cultural perspective with traditional Western culture, but then also international human rights law would help make it more universal. That's an excellent point. Um, so thank you for that, Romano. And I think it's certainly something that we need to be more wary of. I think living in perhaps what we would define as the more developed world, perhaps understanding that in this part of the world there's certain rights that we are given by developed countries, developed governments, certain things that we just expect as a given that don't really exist in some countries around the world. I mean, the minimum wage, for example, we have a minimum wage which is fairly good if you compare it to most other countries, even within the Western world. But if you compare it to some countries, for example, in some parts of continental Africa, if you compare some parts of the Far East, if you compare it to even some countries in the Middle East, they don't have the same level of protection. Governments don't have that same level of regulation over what businesses do and don't do. And that unfortunately does sometimes get exploited. So human rights are not always upheld in the way that we would associate them with being upheld, okay? So for example, the definition of economic security, that is quite ambiguous. How much money equals economic security? Can you put a number on that? Some people argue, no, you can't. No one knows what is economically secure. Is the minimum wage economically secure? Is the minimum wage below that? Some people argue the minimum wage doesn't go far enough in this country. So again, it's due to the fact that perhaps some of the definitions themselves are ambiguous, that it can be difficult. But irrespective of that, what we need to remember is human rights are not upheld in the same way across the globe, okay? And that's something that we need to be more wary of when we think about why is it that certain countries continue to lag behind? Why is it that certain countries don't have the same level of infrastructure, sanitation, living conditions, perhaps even, that we are all fortunate to have in the more Western world? Okay. And just another chat that's come through. So somebody's saying I agree, especially in small island states, the concept is very different to main continents. That's a very, very good point. Sorry, someone wants to say something.
Number way.
Sorry, I don't know who that was. I'll just put them on mute again. And finally, someone else has commented saying at the moment human rights is a Western concept. Okay. But it can be improved by education and religion. Interesting. Yep. And it should be universal, but some countries don't consider human rights. Absolutely. So some of the points that we're just making this. So excellent. Thank you for whoever that was that shared that with us. Absolutely. There is potential for it to be made more universal, but we need to come up with ways in which everyone is singing off the same hymn sheet. It's a consistent way. Otherwise, you're going to continue to have disparity. At the moment, it's mostly between the Western world and some of the developing countries, not all of them, but there is elements of human rights abuse across certain societies. Okay, someone else has just commented there saying human rights is a global concept that is mostly and predominantly talked about after leaders in the Western Hemisphere. Absolutely, I think it tends to be brought up more regularly in more developed economies, so that's an excellent point. Notwithstanding their global affiliation and commitments to human development and survival via various socio-economic responsibilities. 100%. I think that last point that you just made there is probably the most critical. One thing that global leaders in the Western world are good at doing is talking about the need to do something, but when it comes to actually delivering on that, they look to each other. No one is willing to take that leading role. I mean, you have these leading economies, the G8 summit very recently took place in the United Kingdom. Some of the biggest economies in the world came together. But did they actually agree anything that made a big difference? Not really. They talked about the need to do stuff, but nobody actually came up with an agenda. And that's the problem that's faced society throughout the last few decades. Everyone knows that there's disparity. Everyone knows that human rights are not applied equally across the globe, but nobody is really willing to take that step themselves. They're looking at each other to make a difference. So again, thank you very much for everyone that contributed there. The reason I asked this question is to give you something to think about. Okay, so in your assignment, you need to be able to discuss, firstly, what is the concept of CSR and why is it important? So hopefully through today's lecture so far, and with some of these questions I've asked you to think about, you're beginning to build a picture up about what CSR is and why it's important to the world. And we will shortly be moving into looking at what's the role of the business as well in delivering on those. So relatedly, we talk about something called human development. Okay, so HDI. So this is basically a single economic measure, quite similar to GDP in the terms of how we do it, but it doesn't really give a holistic picture of human development. Okay, so it defined itself as something that ought to be perceived in terms of expanding human freedoms, examples being facilities for education and healthcare, as well as those for civil and political rights, okay, rather than narrow views of GDP or individual income growth. So basically, it's looking at how open or how free these countries are for their people to do business, for their people to, have access to the necessary conditions or the ways of life that we would expect in the Western world. We live in relatively free countries here in Europe and the North Americas, places like Australia, even Oceania. These countries, we tend to live a fairly more open type of lifestyle. We have certain rights that aren't necessarily available throughout the globe. Okay, so human development factor measures how able people are in a country to have access to and the right to certain conditions, certain benefits, shall we say, of being able to pursue their life goals. So the United Nations Development Programme, or UNDP, have developed its Human Development Index to provide a more holistic picture of a country's development, going beyond just stuff like GDP. Now, GDP, all it does is measure economic performance. Economic performance is not necessarily the best indication that a country is performing well or a country is doing well. A country could have a fantastic GDP, but the human rights record could be abysmal. They could have very, very poor, they could treat their people like slaves. Why would that mean that economy is doing well just because it has a GDP that's extremely high? So HDI was invented to at least give an indication of how open and able people are in that country to live their own life. And it links back to some of the stuff we talked about already. We talked about on the very second or third slide, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development and their definition. So it's about contributing to the economic development and improving the quality of life. So it's not just about, as I said already, the bottom line, creating profits, creating economic growth. It's also about understanding how do you improve quality of life, and that is something that sits under the CSR realm. It's about the link between human development and CSR, as I've tried to explain to you. For example, child labour can be a manifestation of poor education and high poverty. What do you mean by that? Sometimes people don't necessarily want to send their children to work. They actually have to, and that can be as a result of poor education. So in some countries in the world, if you do a couple of years of primary education, as far as they're concerned, that's it, that's enough. There's no need for you to pursue further education. There's no need for you to go into secondary school, into college, into universities. For them, a few years of education in the school, understanding how to speak the language, understanding basic mathematics, basic sciences is enough. And that's down to the fact that it's a traditional thing. It's something that they've learned from their ancestors, from their societies, is how they live their life. So poor education, but also high poverty. Unfortunately, we live in a world where there is certain conditions where children are led or forced into labour because their family cannot sustain without the children bringing in money. Unfortunately, that's a very sad situation for those children because, as you can imagine, being that young, they're not perhaps equipped and ready to be in the world of work, but they have to because they need to be able to provide for their families. They need to be able to put food on the table for perhaps younger siblings, or even for elderly parents, perhaps, that are unable to work. You see stories, for example, where parents have maybe been injured in work or now no longer can work, and young children are picking up the slack. They're taking on the jobs that really a parent should be doing for their child. But again, why am I telling you this? Because I want you to think about what the implications of this are for business and the role of CSR. Okay, so what are the implications of human development for businesses to think about, and what are the implications for it for corporate social responsibility? We also have what we call social issues. Now, there's different ways in which these are described. You may come across them explained as labour issues. I would argue they also fit the bill of human rights. If you can meet societal needs, you're meeting the needs of human beings. Now, in the workplace, that tends to correlate to things like wages, to things like working hours, working conditions, things like freedom of association, things like discrimination in the workplace, forced labour, and finally child labour. Now, these are all things that are business specific, and I'm sure there's more that you can think of. These are just a few suggestions I've given you, but these are all issues that businesses need to worry about, and some of these apply to the Western world as well. I mean, discrimination in the workplace is a big challenge facing a lot of global companies, not just in developing parts of the world, but also in advanced economies. Discrimination exists in many different forms, whether it be against someone's age, their gender, their sexual preference, their race, the color of their skin, all of these things. There's discrimination existing in the workplace in this country, for example. So even though you could argue Western countries are more aware of human rights and more better at perhaps taking care of their people, there still is a certain degree of improvement required in elements that are important to society. So these are again things that I want you to consider. What is the role of the business in delivering on these? Now, obviously, in an ideal world, the business would pay high wages to everyone, but that's not always sustainable. You can't necessarily pay someone the same amount as someone else simply because you want to make it a more fair place to work. I mean, someone who is doing 12-hour shift cleaning the floor versus someone that does a 5-hour or 8-hour shift manning the door, is it fair to say they're both doing the same job? I don't know. I'll leave that up to you to decide. But wages, there is always going to be discrepancy in wages, and there are reasons for that. Working hours, working conditions, these are all things I want you to think about when you think about the role of a business and what a business does to deliver on CSR. But at the end of the day, whose responsibility is it? I mean, businesses, yes, we've talked about already, but are businesses solely responsible? Does anyone else have a role to play? So again, if you could give me some thoughts in the chat box, whose responsibility is it to ensure that as a society, from a business ethics perspective, we are meeting the needs of global citizens? So whose responsibility is it? If you could please share some thoughts in the chat box with me, please. Okay, a couple of responses coming through in the chat already, so thank you for those. Yep, a couple of the institutional actors that we mentioned, people like governments, international communities, such as civil societies. Yep, absolutely. Apart from corporate organizations as well, absolutely. So some really good suggestions there. Someone else saying it should be all of us, despite the businesses had a key role to play. Yep. At the end of the day, it's government and society that are pivotal role. Absolutely fantastic, guys. Okay, that's what I was looking for. So whilst we talk about business ethics from a role of the business on its own can't necessarily deliver on everything that we as a society need. So you're right, we have a role to play. A, to hold the business to account if it's not doing what we think it should be doing, but B, to push it along, to actually encourage it to keep going. If a business does something good, I mean, yes, we should be applauding them, but by doing that, are we then making them think that they've already gone above and beyond? Why can that not just be the normal? Why can't what a business does above and beyond be treated as the new normal? So thinking about what we have to do in society is quite important. Just another chat come through there saying the most effective respondent should be the government, multinational company owners. Absolutely, and there's a big reason for why we think that. It's because they have the most influence, don't they? If a government of a country says we're doing this, the country does it. If a large CEO, or CEO of Apple says all of a sudden we're moving all of our supply chain back to Europe or we're moving it to the US, all of a sudden everything changes. Or if they decide that they want to give equal wage to all of the supply chain so that regardless of whether you work in sales in an Apple store in London or you work in a factory putting the screen on the iPhone, you're getting the same wage. Yep, absolutely. A CEO has the power to make that influential change. I'm not saying that's what they should do. I'm just giving you examples of what they can do. Okay. So absolutely, thank you again for those that shared their thoughts. So again, something I want you to bear in mind: whose responsibility is it to ensure that we are doing everything we can for society at large? Okay, so something that you should all be looking to for your assessment. So more recently, bringing the discussion into the more contemporary space, the United Nations came up with a new initiative. The goal was to halve global poverty by 2015. Unfortunately, it didn't quite achieve that, but they came up with what were known as 8 Millennial Developmental Goals. And these 8 goals were brought in to try and improve the condition of people across the globe. Okay, so the 8 goals that were set were firstly to eradicate extreme poverty and hunger. They wanted to achieve universal primary education. So every child in every country across this globe should at the very, very least have primary education up until the age of 11 or 12 under their belt. To promote gender equality and to empower women. To reduce child mortality. To improve maternal health. To combat HIV and AIDS, malaria, and other diseases that affect the globe. To ensure environmental sustainability. And finally, a global partnership for development to ensure that countries are working together to develop the globe. Now, unfortunately, as I said, they didn't quite achieve, they weren't able to halve global poverty by 2015, but it did make a substantial difference to the lives of many, many individuals across the globe. As a result, come 2015, they decided they needed to expand that. 8 goals wasn't enough. They came up with Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, as it's now known. So again, this is part of the United Nations. There's 17 of these, and they're dotted around that big circle that you can see on your screen. You can see there's some crossover. So for example, gender equality. We talked about gender equality as part of the first 8. There's also stuff around poverty reduction or ensuring eradicating poverty, no poverty, goal number 1. Again, that's a bit of a carryover, but there is a lot more added here to ensure that we continue to make a difference. So these are the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals that organizations across the globe should be working towards. Universities, for example, have these goals implemented as part of their strategic objectives. For example, where I did my PhD, Strathclyde, they actually had specific goals and objectives as to how they were going to contribute, what were they going to do in their local community and their local area to help deliver on the SDG goals. So again, these are big things. These are very prominent. These are things that companies are doing here and now, or should be doing theoretically on paper here and now. So for your assignment, you may wish to consider some of these developmental goals and think about, what is the reasonable contribution and progress towards them. Think about businesses that already do. You might have an idea of a business that's actually very, very good on the CSR front. Think about the role of that business and what that business does. Okay. Again, this is just a suggestion for your module assessment. This isn't something that this isn't the question per se. This is more of an idea as to how you might want to structure the answer. The question is available through the handbook and through the material shared with you on Moodle. But think about, what is the importance of SDGs? Why are SDGs something that we are concerning ourselves with in today's day and age? And how do businesses contribute towards them? So think about some of the businesses that maybe already do this as a starting point, and then think about why that's important and what the role of that business is. Okay. Right, I realize it's just been over an hour of me talking now, so I'm going to have a short 10-minute break. So I make it 16:02 on my clock. So if I could ask everyone to be back by 16:12 UK time, so 10 minutes, and we will start again. Okay, 10-minute break. Thank you very much. All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. I'll make that 12 minutes past on my clock, so let's get started again. So SDGs, we talked about just there, and the significance of them. Something I want you to consider, perhaps, for your assignment. Prop just had a break, so let's skip from this. Sorry, being too quick with the button today. So what about from a philosophical perspective? So anything we do in research or anything we do in our studies, we should be thinking about what are the philosophical positions that underpin that. So what do you mean by philosophy? So philosophy, for most of you that already know, it's how we understand the world. Okay, so how can we interpret what's going on in the world around us through the lens through which we understand what is happening? So some of the philosophical positions that are important that you might want to consider in your assessment, you've got utilitarianism. So that's basically looking at the greater good, okay? So it's about how do you achieve the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Essentially that's the maths involved here, okay? How can you achieve more using what you have to the benefit of more people, okay? So the greater good essentially. And what it can sometimes involve is what we call short-term sacrifice for long-term benefits. So it's all about ensuring that what you do today is achieving a greater good. It's achieving something that's going to have a long-term or a lasting impact. So short-term sacrifice for a longer benefit. That's what we call the utilitarian approach. All about utility. Then we have what's called the outcome over process approach. So here we say we're acting only according to the maximum of universal law. So what does that mean? It means that people are seen as ends, not as means of notions, okay? So it's about the process as opposed to the outcome. So the outcome of what the business is doing may or may not be important, but the process of how it's doing it should be the important part. So again, yes, the outcome may well be to produce a product that's sold in the market. That might be the outcome for the business, but the process by which they put that product together, where they source the raw materials, how they deal with the supply chain, how they deal with perhaps the local farmers, the local tradespeople that actually start putting the product together, you know, the ground shop floor staff, how they treat them, the process by which the product is put together as being more important than the outcome, i.e. the finished good, okay? So the outcome over process approach it adheres only to what we call the universal law principle. We also have consequentialism. So what does consequentialism mean? Well, it's a fairly difficult one to describe because it's quite subjective, okay? So here we're talking about actions being based on their outcomes. So again, it touches on the stuff that we talked about utilitarianism. So it's about utility or greatest happiness, but it requires what we call a cost-benefit analysis. It's about saying at what point do our costs outweigh the benefits? At what points do we have to cut it off? Okay. It's a very economic way of understanding what a business should be doing. So again, as we said already, big companies have a lot more capital, therefore they usually are able to take part in bigger initiatives. But at the end of the day, they will do what's called a cost-benefit analysis. They will understand that, but if they are spending £10 million on CSR this year, what's the benefit to them as a business? What might they see? Okay, good PR, good publicity. Yes, more people might be aware of them. Yes, they'll make an impact on society. They'll make society a better place. But really, it's about putting a figure on that. How do you put a cost on that? And that's really what consequentialism is all about. What are the consequences of me taking this step today, and what will it mean for me in the future? So it's all about cost-benefit analysis. Then we have what's called virtue ethics. Now, virtue ethics kind of tap into what we call our religious or our personal values. It's about what we see as being morally or ethically correct. So it's almost like this is the way in which we do business. So again, that can be taken both ways. It can be bad or good. Some businesses do things bad and then justify it by saying this is how we've always done it. This is our way of doing business. But other businesses that do things well So you hear of companies like the Body Shop, for example. They're very ethically aware of the impact they're having on the climate, impact they're having on people, on society. And for them, how they operate their business model should be the given. For them, it's just how they do their business. So it's what we call virtue ethics. So the ethical behavior is driven by the character of the moral agent. And in this case, the moral agent tends to be senior management or CEO or someone that's driving the initiative in the organization. We also then have in the final column what we call the rights theory, or what can also be known as justice. So here we're talking about the long-term social outcomes of decisions that are made. So here it's more than just making sure local communities are cared for. It's about making sure there's a positive impact going forward on human rights. It's about making sure that there's justice in terms of process or of the outcome. It's not just about doing things well, it's about justifying how that is then having a longer term impact, okay? Doing things right in today's context might still be seen as doing things wrong in 20 years' time, 30 years' time. So with the rights theory or the justice approach, it's about almost grounding it so that, yes, what you're doing might be right today, but is it right overall? It's a question you have to ask yourself, okay? So it's about ensuring that you're looking at long term rather than perhaps the near or the medium term impact of what you're doing. So these are just a few philosophical positions. Again, you don't need to talk about philosophy directly in your assignment. That's not the purpose of it. But it's always good for any assessment you do for any module to think about, what is the perspective you're taking. And with this class, we're looking at, what is the approach to ethics? What's your understanding of CSR? What's your understanding of the way in which we look after the people of this planet? We've already answered this question, so I'll skip past this, but usually I ask the question again to see if your thinking has evolved. So let's go back to the role of the business then. So where do we see it? Well, number one, in CSR, the role of a business is as someone what we would call a development agent. So what do you mean by development agent? So someone that's consciously striving to deliver developmental goals. They're someone that can be held accountable for developmental outcomes, such as job creation, wealth generation, and meeting the needs by providing goods and services. And finally, motivated by stakeholder concerns. Okay, so developmental agents will take into consideration what stakeholders want. That is to make sure that they're not going against what their people believe in. It's about making sure that they're not violating certain rights and regulations in the local communities, in the local countries, in the governments that they operate under. That on top of the usual profit objective. Okay, so under CSR, under business ethics, we think about all of that as well as profit. It's not just about the profit orientation, it's also about these elements that we've just discussed. So the business, yes, it can be a development agent, but it can also be what's called as a development tool. So what do I mean by that? So basically, there's a quote here I've included for Blowfield and Murray. Now, they're quite prominent writers in business ethics. So if anyone's looking to read further, that's a good book that I can recommend, Blowfield and Murray, 2011. But they essentially say that there's no responsibility for outcomes. Business's usual approach based on cost-return trade-off, competition and profit objectives, positive outcomes can be achieved as an unconscious side effect. So where businesses become a development tool is where the business perhaps doesn't quite consider itself as being someone that's CSR compliant or ethically inclined. It could just be that through their act of carrying out their normal business practice, they're actually contributing to a better society. So let me give you an example. The Body Shop, which I've used already, have very, very ethically aware policies and practices. They don't harm their animals. So that's a big thing for them. Product testing, harm to animals. They want to, every single product that's sold by Body Shop has not, and according to them, will never be tested on an animal at any point, okay? They don't want to use animals as guinea pigs to test and potentially harm them with chemicals. So again, for Body Shop, that's just how they operate. Now, what's the side effect of that? Well, animals are not being harmed. as often, because Body Shop, which is just one company, it's not every single company in that sector, but because of that one company deciding that the way in which they're going to do business is by not using animals for live testing, they've actually had a positive side effect. So that's where we could argue that the business can be seen as a developmental tool. It's not just about what they consciously do, it can also be the subconscious as well. And finally, the business as a corporate giant. Now, under the corporate giant umbrella, we essentially define them in terms of legal status and the ownership of assets. Legally, business corporations are typically regarded as independent from those who work in them, manage them, invest in them, or receive products and services for them. So again, SMEs or small businesses, you tend to find that the owner may well be a worker or a manager, whereas with a corporate giant, the CEO often tends to be someone pretty smart, someone pretty accomplished, but he or she has no other obligation to the business other than being employed by them, okay? They don't necessarily have anything else in common. As such, an entity, they can survive the death of any individual, investor, employee, or customer. They simply need to find a new one. Again, it's a horrible way to think about it, but when a CEO dies, yes, it can change the path the business is taking. It might pursue a new strategy, but the CEO dying doesn't change what the business does. It just goes on as normal. Whereas if you look at a small or medium-sized business that only has maybe 10 employees, and the person that runs the business also owns the business, is also the manager, if they unfortunately pass away, then chances are that business comes to a standstill. There's no one there to provide the capital. There's no one there to run the enterprise. So that's the difference between a corporate giant and a smaller business. But why is that important in CSR terms? Well, businesses are all about adding value and unfortunately sometimes about damaging value. So this is a report conducted by Oxfam in 2009, and they recognised that corporate businesses, they do actually have positive impacts as well. I mean, we'd be wrong if we sat here and said, you know, these businesses are very, very bad, they don't care about society, they don't care about the environment. They do, but unfortunately, they also have a damaging effect as well. So some of the elements that were identified in the Good Fashion Report by Oxfam 2009, so they were looking specifically at the fashion sector, looking at clothing trade. They were looking at stuff around employee recruitment, motivation and retention. They were looking at reputation management, brand identity and value as all being things that can be positively influenced. But again, they can also be negatively influenced. If your business is caught out in a scandal, if your business is seen to be employing unethical practices, these things can suffer. Investor relations and access to capital, compliance with legislation, your competitiveness or what we call your market positioning, the licenses that you have to operate. Now, certain countries have had the licenses removed. Certain businesses have had the licenses to remove for operating in a particular part of the world because there's concerns over their ethical practice, because there's concerns over what they do from a sustainable perspective. We also have operational efficiency. There can be impact on operational efficiency. Effects of CSR also exist on firm profitability, but that is somewhat undecided. The reason we say that is there have been studies done that show obviously profit can be affected if you have negative headlines. But there's also studies that have shown that negative headlines keep a business in the press. They keep a business at the forefront of the customer's mind. And in some cases, business results have actually improved as a result of CSR not being followed as opposed to it being followed. So it's not entirely clear the effect or the link between CSR compliance or non-compliance and profitability, okay? Now on paper, most of the time you will get an improvement. People will see your business as being good, doing something good for society, therefore likely to shop with you. But that's not always the case. There have been instances where businesses who have had negative press because of their poor CSR, but they still had good financial performance. And finally, and this is something that's become more important as of recently, there's such a thing as what we call strategic CSR, okay? So that's when a business actually goes out and has strategies to think about what CSR areas it wants to tackle with a specific goal in mind, okay? So again, I'll give you an example. So if you think of any large corporation, let's think of someone that's maybe struggled over recent years. So say, which business would we say? Let's look at Apple, for example. So Apple had a few negative headlines a couple of years ago about the use of third parties in the Far East and the working conditions. Apparently, there was workers that were committing suicide in some of their factories in China. Now, that's a bad thing for Apple as well as obviously the people affected. But for Apple, as a case of, okay, we're a global powerhouse. People are paying hundreds, if not thousands of pounds for our phones. We can't be seen to be involved or implicated. So what did Apple do? Well, Apple took a series of strategic initiatives. They decided that they would change some of the suppliers. So they did a supply chain review and they removed suppliers that were overworking their staff. They also claim to have brought in new policies for existing ones. Now, again, I say claim because it's been difficult to substantiate. It's been difficult to prove or disprove what Apple have or have not done in these companies. But Apple claim that they have got policies now in place. So if a new supplier wants to join, there's certain checks that Apple will do and Apple will continue to do on a regular basis. So these are all things that Apple have put in place as a result of being caught out by something that was seen as being unethical behavior. So strategic CSR is something that's becoming more and more important. So if you're reading or if you're doing some more research or revision after the class and you come across strategic CSR, I would recommend looking further into that because CSR is now no longer just about doing what's right for society. For businesses, it's also an opportunity to add value. It's an opportunity to gain competitive advantage by doing what's seen as being the right thing. So what about the engagement part? So we talked about why CSR is important. We talked about businesses in terms of how they can do that perhaps, but how do they engage with these elements? So Dalsrud is a prominent author in the space. So Dalsrud 2008, there's a book that he's written and he talks about there being 5 dimensions of corporate social responsibility, okay? So if we start from environmental, work our way around the clock, you've got an environmental component, we talked about environment already. Social component, we've discussed that as well, and economic. So those 3 are kind of overlaps from the first couple of slides. We've then got stakeholders. Now, what do you mean by stakeholders? So depending on what business you're looking at, you will have a different group of stakeholders. And according to Dalsrud, they have an important role to play in how a business engages in its CSR. Why is that? It's because the stakeholders will hold the business accountable. So stakeholders can be people like your shareholders. They can be senior management, they can be junior management, shop floor workers, local community, government, anyone at all that you can think of, suppliers, partner firms, etc. Stakeholders are people that are interested in your business because they've got either a financial interest, they buy your product, they provide you with raw materials, could be anything. But stakeholders, according to Dalsrud, have an important role to play in holding a business accountable to its CSR objectives. And then finally, what's called voluntariness. Now, voluntariness is quite interesting because it looks at how much the business is volunteering to do. So again, if you remember back to what I was saying, there's a few conventions, there's a few rules and regulations brought in by different agencies that a business should abide to, but a lot of them are guidelines. So it depends on how willing a business is, how much a business volunteers to do towards those guidelines that actually measures its success. So for Dalsrud, voluntariness is an important element and something that needs to be considered as to how a business may wish to engage in CSR policy. Carroll's CSR pyramid is something else that's quite important here. So Carroll 1979, Ray Carroll we spoke about already, discusses what it is that leads a business to do what's good. So the bottom layer is profit. Now, obviously, a business can't operate if it doesn't make a profit. So we know that. Okay, so everything that business does is based on making profit. Sorry, someone trying to say something? No? Again, if you just make sure you're in mute, please, that's much appreciated. Okay, so yes, profit, as I was saying, is the most important element. Every business would, any business would sink without the profitability component. So that's the fundamental first layer or the bottom layer of the pyramid. But as you build up, it's then about thinking outside of profitability and economic gain. Number three is all about obeying the law. If the business isn't obeying the law of that country, chances are they'll end up in court, they'll end up getting their licenses revoked, and they won't be able to do business. Okay, so for example, Apple in the UK, if Apple decided that they wanted to pay below the minimum wage, the UK government would step in. They would take Apple to court, they would sue them and say, can Apple now repay all of the workers? And can we also remove Apple's license to work in the UK? So obeying the law is an important part. In order for a business to operate, it needs to be obeying the law. So for Carol, that's the second bottom layer of the pyramid, or layer number three. After profit, need to think about making sure they're abiding by the law and doing everything that's right in line with the codification and regulation in that particular country. After that, it's about ethics. It's about the obligation of doing what is right, just, and fair. Okay, it's about ensuring that the business is not doing anything that harms local community, local environment, doesn't do anything that harms the local almost ecosystem of how work is done. Okay, so ethics is something that's quite key on Carol's CSR pyramid. But then for Carol, number one is what we call being a good corporate citizen. So that's contributing resources to the community. That's about improving the quality of life. That's about creating opportunities for people. It's about going above and beyond to deliver what's socially good. And for Carol, these are the four layers of the CSR pyramid that are important. Again, a good model that you may want to refer to when discussing your business. If you choose a business and want to talk about what they do, you might want to use Carol's pyramid to demonstrate how they do or do not conform to CSR practice. So for Carol, the combination of all four is what leads a business to be able to claim that they are truly CSR compliant. I've got an example here for you, thinking about tobacco. So some of you may or may not consume tobacco products, smoke, etc. So how the CSR element in tobacco has worked over the years. So there's four different approaches that usually are adopted. The first layer is react. So that's when a business reacts to what's going on already. So it's usually about denying responsibility or saying, oh my God, this has happened. How do we minimize its impact? Okay, so it's usually denying or mitigating any real responsibility. Once a business realizes that, okay, hold on a minute, there's more importance to this, it's not just about what I think, they then move into defense mode. So that's when they try to defend their actions. They try and say, okay, yes, maybe mistakes were made, but here's why they were made. Okay, so try to defend their actions. The accommodation stage, and this stage is quite important in a business understanding of where they've gone wrong. This is where they say, okay, we've made mistakes, and here's what it means for us. Here is what is now demanded from people around us as a result of our mistake. But pro-action is probably the most important stage. This is the stage when a business goes above and beyond the industry norms and it anticipates future expectations by doing more than what is expected. So let's put that into, let's give you an example of the tobacco industry. So if we start from the bottom with the reaction, so when there were reports coming out suggesting that there's a clear link that smoking leads to long-term health problems, for a number of years, tobacco companies outright denied that there was a problem. They claimed that these reports were wholly wrong and that there is nothing wrong with consuming tobacco. Tobacco does not cause health problems. Now, obviously, we know that's false, and it does. But when the first report was produced, that showed a link between tobacco consumption and poor health, tobacco companies came out and denied that was an accurate report. Okay. Then what happened? Well, after it became visible that there was lots of reports all saying the same thing, the tobacco industry went into what we call defense mode. So they fought anti-tobacco campaigns Lots of people, stakeholders, were campaigning for tobacco companies to stop selling tobacco or to make tobacco safer. But what did tobacco companies do? Well, they tried to fight those campaigns by denying any knowledge of the addictive nature of nicotine. They started lobbying government, and they started delaying litigation cases. So what do you mean by that? Well, they started spending money, telling government ministers they're contributing in tax, bankrolling government parties. So again, the government was maybe slower to react because the government was being bankrolled. They also delayed litigation cases. So rather than taking cases to court, they tried to delay the process. They tried to drag it out so people would stop suing them, people would stop taking them to court. Then they moved into a stage that was called accommodation. Now that tends to happen usually in the real world after a few years, but that's when a business admits that they're in a controversial industry and that their marketing is risky. So this is what the tobacco industry did. They admitted that they were in a controversial industry and that what they're marketing or selling are risky products. And they've now started anti-smoking youth programs. So what they did was they came out with youth programs that were designed to encourage young people to give up smoking. And then finally, the proactive stage. Now, this didn't happen until relatively recently, but tobacco industry have now brought in what's called stakeholder dialogue workshops. So basically, they bring in stakeholders, whether that's customers, whether that's government policymakers, whether that's other industry people that are affected by tobacco, and they started talking to them and saying, okay, what can we do to make things better? What can we do to ensure that people are well aware of the risks of the health implications? So again, this is an example I'm giving you. The reason I'm giving it to you is to make you think about how can you apply CSR in your chosen company or industry. Now there's a small exercise that I usually make people do. So can you name of any other businesses on the top of your head who engage in ethical practice? Those companies that are socially and ethically responsible, knowing what you now know. So based on today's lecture, based on what I've discussed, based on what I've told you, can you now name me some companies or some businesses that from the top of your head are good ethical companies? They engage in ethical practices, they are socially and ethically responsible. So I'll open the chat again. So if you could share your thoughts in the chat, if you could tell me some companies that you're not aware of who you believe are good corporate social citizens, they're good ethical businesses. Great, a couple of examples coming in already. Two people have now said Coca-Cola. Absolutely, Coca-Cola, whilst they admit that fizzy drinks are not dangerous, but certainly can harm health of population, they've actually started understanding that they have a role to play in limiting, and they've started bringing more healthy drinks. They started having campaigns where they're encouraging children to get active. So yeah, Coca-Cola is a good example. And Tata Motors India, interesting. I'm not entirely aware of their ethical standpoints. If anyone is aware and wants to share their thoughts, please, by all means, do let us know. I can't really comment on Tata Motors. I'm not too familiar with what their ethical position is. Gambling companies, 100%. So again, if you go back 15, 20 years, gambling companies simply wash their hands. They said it's not their job to take care of how people spend their money. It's their job to, provide the option to bet. But more recently, they started to understand that gambling can be addictive. It's a problem. It can lead to people going into serious debt and, in some cases, deaths or serious injuries when people harm themselves. So gambling companies 100% have now got certain policies or certain restrictions in place that try to curb how much harm can be done through gambling. So yeah, 100% good examples. Okay, I think you guys are getting the hang of what I'm trying to say. I think you're understanding. pharmaceutical companies with side effects? Yep, 100%. So again, previously, if you go back maybe a little bit longer, 100 years ago or even 50, 60 years ago, a lot of them just denied that there were side effects, or they just denied that they tested the products not on humans but on other species or other animals. And obviously, if something works on an animal, it doesn't mean it's going to work on a human. So a lot of the time, pharmaceutical companies were trying to not to disclose until the government stepped in and said, no, that's quite important. We need to make sure that you're being clear and transparent on where you've tested the products. So absolutely, and what the side effects are. Great. Aviation industry, Emirates and Qatar Airlines. Absolutely. So again, Emirates and Qatar, for those of you that might not be familiar with them, are Middle Eastern airlines, and two places in the world where there has been perhaps human rights violations in terms of labour that's been brought in from other countries to help construction, to help things work. So yep, 100%. These companies have held their hands up and said, yep, okay, we might not have treated these people right. We need to now make a difference. Great, guys, good examples. Thank you very much. So I'm just going to stop the exercise there for that. But yes, I think you're all understanding what I'm trying to say and what the impact of this is. So despite all of that, and despite everything we talked about today, some businesses, they just don't care. Now you might think, what do you mean? But really, they just don't care. And I've got here a Nestle case study. Now, usually I would go through it with you, but we don't have much time. 15 minutes isn't going to be enough time. So what I'll do is I'm going to post the link. So if you bear with me, I'm just going to get the link up and I will share the link in the chat. If you have time, which I hope you will at some point over the next couple of days, please do try and read this case study. This goes to show Nestle and how Nestle, they've now adopted and now changed ever so slightly, but Nestle have been very, very naughty, shall we say, with their approach to business ethics and CSR. And this case study gives you a little bit more information. It's how they've been polluting certain parts of the world and how they've actually been accused of using child labour as well. So you may be familiar with Nestle. I'm sure most of you are, the chocolate company, but they do a lot more than just chocolate. They've got a lot of different food brands under their umbrella. So when you get a chance, I would encourage you to read the Nestle case study and really try to understand why Nestle did what they did and what the long-term impact of what Nestle did was on both them as a business, but also about the societies and the countries in which they were accused of these malpractices. Okay. And that's really it for today. There's nothing really more for me to say to you in terms of introducing the kind of core fundamentals of business ethics and understanding the role of CSR. I've got some readings up on the slide. Now, again, I don't expect you to go and read every single one, but these are some of the things that were referenced in my presentation today. So I gave you some quotations. I made reference to some readings. So these are ones that I would recommend you go away, and if you are looking to read, some of these may be useful for you, okay? Yes. Any questions on today's lecture then, given that we're now at the end of the session? Anything anyone would like to ask? Anyone at all? No, you're very quiet. Well, listen, if there's no questions, I hope you all enjoyed the session. I hope you all got something new, interesting, something to think about from today's session that you can maybe use for your assessment. But really the kind of fundamental purpose or the fundamental takeaway from today is to start thinking about what business ethics really means, okay? Because we talk about CSR, we talk about ethics, and it can be easy to fall into a trap of just defining it. That's not what we want you to do in this class. We don't want you to define it. We want you to think about, okay, if that's what business ethics is, or that's how it's explained, what does that actually mean for how businesses operate? Do they conform? Do they not conform? What are some of the reasons? How can we understand the level of conformance using some of the business models that I introduced to you today? So for example, the pyramid or Dalsrud's 5 stages. These are just some examples of models that you may want to use, but really understanding why businesses are responsible and what businesses should be doing, okay? Someone, I believe, has just asked about sharing slides. So the recording for the presentation will be shared with you. If you don't know where to find it, if you contact the program team at LSBR or Abhishek Chowdhury, so Abhishek at lsbr.org, he will be able to give you the information, okay? So everything that's recorded is stored by LSBR. Great. Well, listen, I hope you all enjoyed the lecture, as I said already. And yes, we'll be in touch with you for the next session. So there is a second part to business ethics, which we're going through very, very shortly. Great. If there's no further questions, I'll let you all go. Thank you very much for your time today.